There's a quiet hum to life, isn't there? A rhythm most folks fall into without even realizing it. You wake up, the sun's barely thinking about peeking over the horizon, and you get yourself ready. You head out, join the river of taillights, or maybe just walk the same path you've walked 1,000 times before. Then you spend your day, 8 hours, 10, sometimes more, putting in the work. Turning wrenches, pushing buttons, filling out forms, whatever it is. And you do it because that's what a good man does. You provide. You keep the roof over your head, food on the table, clothes on your kids' backs. That's the measure, isn't it? The steady pay stub, the bills paid on time, the comfortable hum of stability. For many years, that was the whole story. The grand ambition, if there ever was one, often dwindled to the simple aspiration of holding on. Holding on to the job, holding on to the sense of purpose that came from knowing you were a cog, a necessary piece in a bigger machine. And there's a dignity in that, no doubt. A quiet pride in honest labor, in the sweat on your brow at the end of a long shift. You might even find yourself looking at the clock, watching the minutes tick down, and feeling a small, weary satisfaction as the day finally gives way to evening. The world keeps spinning, the gears keep grinding, and you're right there with it, playing your part beneath the indifferent glow of harsh fluorescent lights. But sometimes when the house is quiet, and the light through the window starts to fade from the bright starkness of day to a softer, warmer glow, a color like worn leather or a comforting memory, a different kind of thought can sneak in. It's not a loud thought, not a demand. More like a whisper. A faint question carried on the scent of wood smoke or old coffee. Is this it? Is this all there is to build? A good life, a stable life, yes. But what about the things that truly last? What about the mark of your own hands, your own particular way of seeing the world, etched not into a pay stub, but into something enduring? Something meaningful, built not just for stability, but for the sheer, quiet joy of making it, piece by careful piece, on your own terms. That whisper, quiet as it might be, has a way of settling in, sometimes for years, until it simply can't be ignored anymore. It had certainly settled in Dale, slowly, like dust on a forgotten shelf, over 48 years of life, nearly 30 of them spent on the line. Dale, that's what folks called him. Not much for fancy names, nor for fancy anything, really. If you saw him, you'd know. He was a man built for hard work, every pound of his 260-pound frame stretching his 511. Height, settled like a comfortable, well-worn tool. He carried that weight mostly in his gut, a testament to years of shift meals and the occasional beer, but beneath it there was a sturdiness, a deep-set strength. His face was a roadmap of that life. A square jaw, perpetually stubbled with a mix of brown and gray, hinted at a stubborn streak. But it was his eyes that really told the story. Tired blue, ringed by deep worry lines that stretched to the corners of his sun-kissed skin. They were observant eyes, though, missing little even if he didn't say much about what he saw. Above them, his thinning brown hair, now a good 40% gray, was combed back, struggling against a receding hairline that only added to the weary look. And his hands, oh, his hands, they were the truest testament to Dale's journey. Thick, the palms a tapestry of calluses, knuckles often scraped from a misaimed wrench or a snagged piece of metal. Under his fingernails, oil stains were ingrained so deep, they looked like part of the very bone. Yet, for all their roughness, they had a strong, steady grip, capable of surprising gentleness when the task called for it. He moved with a quiet purpose, a steady, deliberate gait that spoke of years spent walking factory floors. At the plant, amidst the clang and hum, Dale was a fixture. He'd offer a gruff nod to a passing colleague, maybe a curt comment about the weather or the efficiency report, but mostly he kept to himself. He was a good man, everyone agreed, reliable, always showed up, always did his job. The type who knew the machinery better than the schematics, the kind of quiet, steady anchor every operation needed. When the shift ended, usually under a sky that still held the dark, steel blue of dawn or was just turning the softer, muted tan of late afternoon, he'd climb into his old Ford F-150. It was a well-kept truck, despite its dents and the years it had seen. Reliable, just like Dale. Often there, DB tools or lumber rattling in the bed for some small repair at home or helping a neighbor out. Home was a small, well-maintained house built in the 70s, nestled in a blue-collar neighborhood where every yard looked much like the next. He'd built a small workshop in the detached garage, mostly for routine repairs, sometimes a little carpentry for Sarah, his wife of 26 years, a steady woman, 47 now, who understood the quiet rhythm of his life. Their two kids, Mark, 25, and Emily, 22, had both flown the coop, off chasing their own paths, whatever they might be. Money was okay, but tight. Dale wasn't drowning, not by a long shot. Every bill got paid every month. But luxuries were rare, tucked away for birthdays or anniversaries. Life was lived paycheck to paycheck, a steady exchange of effort for security. For as long as he could remember, Dale had seen success in the pay stub. His worth, he figured, was measured in how well he provided in the roof over his family's head, the food on their table, the fact that no one ever had to worry. That was his job. That was his purpose. He'd spent decades building someone else's dream, tightening nuts, welding seams, moving product down a line under the harsh, unwavering fluorescent glow that seemed to drain the color from everything. He didn't love it, not really, but he was good at it. And for a long time, that was enough. It was just life. A quiet resignation settled deep in his bones, a sense that this was simply the way things were, the path laid out for a man like him. It never occurred to him there might be another way to measure what truly lasted. The hum of the machinery was a constant companion, a dull roar that vibrated through the concrete floor and up into Dale's thick work boots. 48 years old, his body carried the testament of those decades, a heavy-set frame, a gut that had grown steadily over the years, and hands that told 1,000 stories without ever speaking. Under the harsh, fluorescent glow that leached the color from his surroundings, his calloused palms gripped wrenches, adjusted levers, and wiped away the persistent sheen of grease that never quite left his skin. Every evening, as he drove his dented but reliable Ford F-150 home, the quiet of the cab offered little respite from the thrumming echoes in his mind. Lately, the quiet resignation had begun to fray at the edges. He'd watched the younger guys, fresh out of technical school, come onto the floor. They moved with a different kind of ambition, their eyes bright with the promise of promotions, of better jobs, of leaving this place for something more. They'd talk about career paths, about upward mobility, about building their portfolios. Dale would just offer a gruff nod, watching them, a slow, heavy feeling settling in his chest. He saw himself in their earnestness, a younger, slimmer version with less gray in his thinning hair, but also felt a widening chasm. They were building something for themselves. He'd just been building. It wasn't a regret he spoke aloud, not even to Sarah. It was a memory, more like a ghost, that would sometimes drift into his mind while he was tightening a bolt or waiting for a machine cycle to finish. He'd been good with his hands always, not just for fixing things, but for shaping them. Back in high school, he'd spent hours in shop class, the smell of sawdust and varnish a balm to his soul. He'd carved a small wooden bird once, a simple, elegant thing with detailed feathers that seemed to almost fly from the wood. Mr. Henderson, his shop teacher, a man whose own hands were perpetually stained with wood glue, had told him he had a real knack, a meticulous eye for detail. "You could build anything, Dale," he'd said. "Make a living with these hands." But life had happened. College wasn't an option, not really. There was the need to provide, to contribute. The factory offered steady pay, good benefits. The dream of making beautiful things, things that lasted and were his asterisk, had been quietly shelved, gathering dust like an old blueprint. Now those young faces and their forward momentum made him wonder if he'd simply become another cog in someone else's great machine. What would be left when he was gone? A fully paid-off house, sure. Two good kids, grown and out on their own, making their own lives. But what about him? He feared being forgotten, a faceless worker whose contribution was measured only in units produced. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach, a quiet dread that kept his tired blue eyes open long after Sarah had drifted off beside him. His hands, thick and strong, with knuckles often scraped and oil ingrained under the fingernails, felt less like tools of creation and more like instruments of obligation. He knew their strength, their unwavering persistence, but what were they truly building on his own terms? He had ideas, small glimmers of what he could do, but they were quickly dismissed, pushed down by a lifetime of assuming his thoughts weren't valuable, that his own capabilities weren't enough to make a dent. He found himself staring at the ceiling in the pre-dawn dark, the house quiet save for the distant rumble of the early morning traffic. The worry lines around his eyes and mouth seemed deeper in the dimness, etched by years of silent anxieties. He felt a weariness that went beyond the physical demands of his job, a deep-seated ache in his soul. He was a man accustomed to routine, to the predictability of the grind. But lately, a new, unsettling question had begun to surface, bubbling up from the quiet depths of his own unspoken disappointments. Was this all there was? Was this the sum total of Dale, the man who was good with his hands? The question hung heavy in the warm, evening air that sometimes filtered into his small, well-maintained house, a stark contrast to the harsh, fluorescent reality of his days. He needed a purpose that wasn't dictated by the clock, a legacy that wasn't measured in a single pay stub. He just didn't know what it was, or if he even deserved to find it. The hum of the presses at the factory was a dull, constant thrum, a sound that had long ago burrowed itself deep into Dale's bones, becoming as much a part of him as the ache in his knees after a double shift. Day in, day out, for nearly 30 years, he'd watched raw metal transform into parts for machines he'd never see, for purposes he'd never understand, all under the same unforgiving fluorescent lights. His thick, calloused palms, permanently stained with oil and grime, moved with an almost robotic precision, feeding sheets of steel into the hungry maw of a stamping machine, then catching the perfectly shaped piece that emerged. It was a dance he knew intimately, a rhythm that demanded no thought, only repetition. He was good at it, meticulous in his movements, ensuring every piece met spec. But the satisfaction had long since been wrung out of the process, leaving only the quiet resignation that this was just life. He'd watched the younger guys, fresh out of tech school, eyes bright with ambition. He remembered a kid named Marcus, maybe 25, who joined the line just last year. Marcus was always talking, full of ideas about process improvements, about starting his own small fabrication shop one day. Dale would offer a gruff nod, a silent acknowledgement of the kid's energy, and just keep working. He saw others, too, climb the ladder, promotions to floor manager to quality control, or just plain leave for what they called better opportunities. He never chased those things, never saw the point, not really. His job was to provide, to keep Sarah and the kids fed, the house warm. He was good at that, good enough. But watching Marcus, watching the others, a subtle, cold truth began to crystallize in his mind, unwelcome and sharp. They were building something for themselves. They were chasing their asterisk dreams. And all this time, all these years, he'd been an essential cog in someone else's. His strength, his persistence, his meticulous hands. All used to build another man's empire, piece by anonymous piece. The question from the pre-dawn dark resurfaced, sharper now. What was he building? The answer came, as it often does, not with a grand epiphany, but with a sudden, brutal jolt. It was late spring, a Tuesday. The humidity was already thick, even inside the sprawling factory. He was wrestling a particularly heavy die into place, the sweat beading on his brow, trickling down his temples. He grunted, strained, felt the familiar burn in his shoulders. Then a sharp, searing pain exploded in his chest, a sudden, brutal fist clenching around his heart. It wasn't the usual muscle ache, not the familiar throb of overworked joints. This was different, urgent, malicious. His breath hitched, caught somewhere between his throat and his lungs. The heavy die slipped from his grasp, clattering to the concrete floor with a deafening crash that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden, echoing silence inside his head. The world tilted. The fluorescent lights blurred into a sickening halo. A cold, clammy sweat instantly broke out over his skin, chilling him despite the oppressive heat. He stumbled back, one hand instinctively clutching his chest, the other reaching out blindly, desperate for something to brace himself against. His legs felt like jelly, threatening to give out beneath his 260 pounds. He could hear voices, distant and muffled, but they sounded like they were underwater. His vision narrowed to a pinprick, the edges encroaching in a dizzying gray. Fear, stark and primal, seized him, a fear unlike any he'd ever known. This was it. The thought materialized, unbidden, terrifyingly clear. This was how it ended. He was on the ground before he knew it, gasping, trying to drag air into lungs that felt seized up. Someone was shouting. Someone was kneeling beside him, their face a blurry smudge above his. He vaguely registered the siren growing louder, closer. Then the sterile white of an ambulance ceiling, the jarring bumps of the road, and the hushed, urgent voices of paramedics. The hospital was a blur of tests, machines humming, beeping, wires attached to his chest, a tight cuff squeezing his arm. Sarah was there, her face pale with worry, her hand gripping his so tightly it hurt. Mark and Emily, grown kids suddenly looking small and scared, stood awkwardly in the doorway. It went on for hours. The waiting, the uncertainty, the fear that coiled like a snake in his gut. Finally, a kind-faced doctor with spectacles arrived, tapping a pen against a clipboard. "It wasn't a heart attack, Dale," the doctor said, his voice calm, reassuring. "Just a severe angina episode." A wake-up call, stress, a bit of high blood pressure, cholesterol's up. Nothing a few changes won't fix. But you need to take it easier, really look after yourself. The relief that washed over him was profound, almost sickening in its intensity. He hadn't just dodged a bullet, he'd been given another chance. But beneath the relief, a deeper tremor remained. He saw Sarah's tear-streaked face, the fear in his children's eyes. He had stared mortality right in the face, and it had blinked. Driving home in his old Ford F-150, the dented but reliable truck feeling suddenly fragile, the silence inside the cab was deafening. The setting sun cast long shadows over the blue-collar neighborhood, painting his small, well-maintained house in hues of soft gold and deepening gray. He looked at his hands, thick and scarred, still with the faintest hint of oil under the nails, hands that had built so much, yet so little of it his own. What had he truly wanted to leave behind? Not just a paycheck, not just the memory of a hard worker. He wanted something lasting, something meaningful built with purpose on his asterisk terms. The thought, once a vague ache, now roared with the force of a full-blown realization. He didn't just need a purpose, he needed a legacy, and he hadn't started building it yet. The F-150 idled in the driveway, its engine a low rumble that felt like a heartbeat in the quiet night. Dale didn't turn the key right away. The streetlights cast long, lonely shadows that stretched across the lawns, cool and blue like a bruised sky. Inside the small house, Sarah would be sleeping, probably still shaken. He pushed the heavy door open, the familiar creak echoing in the sudden silence of the cab, and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved through the house like a ghost, easing the door shut, shrugging off his jacket, the familiar weight of it suddenly foreign. The air was still and cool, tinged with the faint scent of Sarah's lavender sachet from the hallway closet. He checked on her, a silent sentinel in the doorway of their bedroom. Her breathing was soft, even. The bedside clock glowed a faint green. 11:47 p.m., too early for the real thoughts to start their prowl. He made his way to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, the clink of ice cubes unnaturally loud in the stillness. He leaned against the counter, the cool tile against his thick forearms, his eyes scanning the familiar space. The children's growth chart still marked on the doorframe, faded photos on the fridge, Mark's high school graduation, Emily's first dance recital. Memories, good memories. He had provided for them, undeniably, worked every day, paid every bill, kept a roof over their heads. That had always been the measure, hadn't it? The steady pay stub, the full fridge, the car in the driveway. He had believed that was success. That was his job, his purpose. And for decades, that belief had been enough. It had been a quiet resignation, a dull hum beneath the surface of his life. This was just life, but the doctor's words, the sudden, sharp fear, had ripped through that resignation like a freight train. Now, hours later, the words still echoed. "You got lucky, Dale, but this is a wake-up call." He looked at his hands, calloused and thick, the knuckles often scraped, oil stains ingrained under the nails from the factory floor. They were strong hands, capable hands. They had tightened a million bolts, operated heavy machinery, changed countless diapers, fixed leaky faucets. But what had they truly built? Something for himself. Something that wasn't just a component in someone else's machine, someone else's profit margin. He walked through the darkened living room, the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds, casting strips of muted gray across the worn carpet. He saw the faces of the younger guys at the factory, hungry, ambitious. Always talking about promotions, moving up, moving on, chasing better jobs, building their own empires. He'd watch them go, sometimes with a quiet envy, mostly with a shrug. That wasn't for him. He was Dale. He was the constant, the steady hand. The man who knew the machines inside and out. He was indispensable in his own way to them. But what about to himself? The clock in the living room chimed, soft and resonant, marking the turn of the hour. 1 o'clock, 2, 3. Sleep was a distant shore, shimmering, unreachable. His mind, unburdened by the daily grind, now gnawed at him. He sat in his old armchair, the springs groaning faintly under his weight, staring into the silent darkness. A deep-seated yearning for purpose, long buried under the demands of daily life, began to ache. A quiet fear of being forgotten, a fear that his life, for all its steady hard work, would simply dissipate like factory steam, leaving no trace. He had spent his life building someone else's dream, tightening the screws on their asterisk vision. The realization was stark, cold, like the metallic taste of fear in his mouth. He was good at what he did. Meticulous, persistent. But that persistence, that attention to detail, had always been in service of another's plan. And his own ideas. They usually withered before they even saw the light of day. Who was Dale to have big ideas? That was his flaw, a nagging voice in the back of his mind, always underestimating his own capabilities, always assuming his ideas weren't valuable. He thought of the small, detached garage in the backyard, its windows dark, his workshop. A place he retreated to sometimes for small repairs, for puttering, a place that felt like his own, yet he hadn't truly claimed it. The space was there, the tools were there. What would it take to fill it with his asterisk purpose? To build something lasting, Not just a paycheck, not just the memory of a hard worker. He wanted something else. Something meaningful, built with his own thick hands on his asterisk terms. The thought, once a vague ache in his chest, now roared with the force of a full-blown realization. He didn't just need a purpose, he needed a legacy. And he hadn't started building it yet. The night stretched on, a vast, echoing chamber for his fears, but also for the first time in a long time, for a stubborn, quiet hope that pulsed beneath the surface of his weary, blue eyes. The quiet hope, for a man like Dale, wasn't a sudden burst of fireworks. It was more like the slow, steady hum of an old, reliable engine finally catching proper idle after years of sputtering. He sat there in the dim glow of the living room long after Sarah had gone to bed, the scent of stale coffee clinging to the air, and felt it deep in his bones. A quiet, unshakable certainty. Decades. 48 years he'd spent on this earth, and too many of those in the clang and whir of the plant, building parts for other people's dreams, not his own. He pictured the conveyor belts, the rhythmic press of the machines, the same faces day in and day out, all of them wearing that same weary resignation. He'd seen younger fellas come and go, bright-eyed and ambitious, chasing promotions or leaving for what they called better opportunities. He'd watched them, always from a distance, with a gruff nod but never a word, telling himself their path wasn't his. His path was to provide, to make sure the bills were paid, that Sarah had her garden, that Mark and Emily had a shot at something more. He'd done that, sure. He always paid the bills, even if it meant passing on a new fishing rod or another trip to the hardware store for some luxury he did really need. But what about him? The question, once just a faint echo, now vibrated through his chest, a deep thrumming ache that wouldn't be ignored. He thought of that slight shortness of breath he'd felt a few months back, the doctor's grim face, the tests that thankfully came back clear but left a cold imprint on his heart. A wake-up call, they'd called it. For Dale, it had been a full-blown siren. He wasn't getting any younger. His thinning, gray-streaked hair, his stubbled jaw with its worry lines, the deep grooves around his tired blue eyes, they weren't just signs of hard work anymore. They were also a clock ticking down. He looked at his hands, thick and calloused, oil stains ingrained under the fingernails. Strong hands, capable hands. What had they built for him? For Dale? Beyond the paycheck, beyond the house, beyond the kids who were now grown and flown. Nothing, he realized. Just someone else's quarterly report. A deep breath swelled his heavy chest, pushing against the weight of years of quiet acceptance. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with unspoken truths. Enough. He murmured the word barely a whisper, yet it felt like a clap of thunder in the silent room. It wasn't angry, not dramatic. It was simply final asterisk, a decision that settled into his bones with the weight of granite. He didn't know what it meant, not yet. He didn't have a plan or a map or even a clear destination. But he knew with an unshakable resolve that surprised even himself that something had to change. This quiet life, this steady grind, this was no longer enough. He needed to build something. Something true, something lasting, something entirely his own. The first step, he realized, was simply deciding to take one. And in that moment, in the soft, fading light of a new day filtering through the blinds, Dale felt a shift. A tremor of purpose, small but significant, began to stir in the depths of his soul. The tremor didn't manifest as a sudden burst of energy, not with Dale. It was more like the slow rumble of an old engine finally catching, shaking off years of dormancy. He spent the next few days in a quiet daze at the factory, his hands moving through the familiar motions, yet his mind was elsewhere. He observed the younger guys, chasing the next rung on the ladder, their ambition a stark contrast to his own years of steady, unexamined contribution. He felt no envy, just a clearer understanding of what he didn't want anymore. He didn't want to chase someone else's rung. He wanted to build his own ladder, even if it was just a stool. The thought of building something gnawed at him. What could it be? He wasn't an inventor, not an artist. His skills were practical, solid, rooted in the tangible. One evening, driving home in his dented, reliable Ford, his eyes caught a glimpse of an old, discarded dresser on the curb. A broken leg, a drawer missing, but the faint ghost of intricate carving was still visible beneath layers of chipped paint. Something about its forgotten dignity, its potential, snagged in his mind. Restore, the word settled in. To take something broken, forgotten, and give it new life on its own terms. That felt right. That felt like purpose. That Saturday, Dale drove his F-150 to the dusty corners of a local antique shop, a place he'd never stepped foot in before. He walked past polished teacups and framed portraits, his heavy boots scuffing the worn floorboards, heading straight for the back where the project pieces were piled. They were sad, forgotten things: a wobbly chair, a scratched-up chest, a table missing a chunk of its apron. His eyes, usually scanning for machine faults or precise measurements, now saw something different: potential. He picked out a small, unassuming bedside table, its cherrywood hidden under a thick, dark varnish. One of its delicate spindle legs snapped clean off. It was cheap, almost an afterthought. The cashier barely looked up. Back home, the table sat in the center of his small, detached garage, dwarfed by the usual clutter of wrenches, power tools, and lumber scraps. This was his sanctuary, his workshop, usually reserved for fixing a leaky faucet or building a sturdy shelf for Sarah. But tonight, it felt different. The evening light, usually just fading, now seemed to hold a promise, casting long, golden shadows across the concrete floor and the stacks of rough-cut wood. The air hung thick with the familiar smell of sawdust and old oil, but now a subtle hint of aged wood and varnish was beginning to permeate. He stood over the table for a long time, his calloused hands on his hips, his tired blue eyes studying every scratch, every joint, every splinter. The enormity of it, the foreignness of it, started to press down on him. He hadn't done anything like this before, not really. Fixing something was one thing, restoring it, bringing out its inherent beauty, felt like an entirely different beast. Self-doubt, that old nagging companion, began to whisper in his ear. "What makes you think you can do this, Dale? You're a factory man. You push buttons, turn levers. You don't make art." His square jaw tightened. Worry lines around his eyes deepened. The whisper gnawed at him, digging into the familiar ruts of his self-doubt. He'd spent decades pushing himself through the long shifts, the endless repetition of the line, telling himself that providing for Sarah and the kids was all the art he needed. And it was important, still was. But the thought, once a quiet hum, now roared. Was that all? He sighed, a low rumble from deep in his chest. His thick, calloused palms, usually stained with oil and factory grime, felt oddly clean, even soft against his overalls. He moved slowly, a heavy man in a heavy world, one foot dragging after the other, towards the factory break room. The fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly greenish glow on the dented vending machine and the chipped formica tables. His lunch sat untouched in front of him, a tuna sandwich Sarah had packed, now looking as tired as he felt. He picked at a loose thread on his oil-stained sleeve, the whisper about building someone else's dream still rattling in his head like a loose screw. This wasn't life, not really. This was waiting. A week later, the waiting felt different. He was still on the line, still moving at the rhythm of the machines, but his mind wasn't entirely there. Instead, it was on the stripped-down side table in his garage, the stubborn old varnish he'd finally broken through, the smooth, dark grain of the wood beneath. His thick, calloused palms, usually stiff and aching by quitting time, now felt a peculiar tingle and anticipation for the evening. He moved slower on the factory floor, perhaps, but with a different kind of presence, less slumped. "Hey, Dale," a younger fella, name of Kevin, called out across the noisy assembly line one afternoon. Kevin was the ambitious type, always talking about promotions. "You look less dead today, old man. Did you win the lottery or something?" Kevin grinned, wiping grease from his brow with the back of his hand. Dale just grunted, a low rumble from deep in his chest. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his mouth before he turned back to his station. Less dead. The words echoed in his head, a strange kind of compliment. Maybe Kevin was right. He certainly felt less dead. The dull ache in his bones was still there, sure, but it was being overshadowed by something else. A quiet buzz of purpose that hummed beneath his skin, far more satisfying than any lottery ticket. The harsh fluorescent light of the factory still pressed down, but in his mind's eye, he could already see the warm glow of the bare bulb in his workshop, illuminating the curve of a mahogany leg. Evenings in the detached garage had become a kind of sanctuary. The air, once stale with the scent of old gasoline and dust, now carried the sweet, earthy aroma of sawdust and wood polish. Dale would stand there, a little heavier in his gut than he liked, but his tired blue eyes alight with a focused intensity. He'd spend hours, meticulously sanding away decades of neglect from a forgotten chest of drawers he'd found by the curb. His hands, usually marred by nicks and oil, now bore faint streaks of wood stain, the ingrained grease under his fingernails slowly being replaced by fine, pale dust. The worry lines around his eyes and mouth hadn't vanished, but they seemed softer, perhaps. Less like permanent etchings of burden, more like tracks of careful thought. He'd talk to the wood sometimes, under his breath, slow and deliberate, pausing to consider his words as if it might answer back. "All right, old friend," he'd murmur, running a thick thumb over a newly smooth surface. Let's see what you're really made of." There was a quiet strength in his grip as he wielded a chisel, a meticulous attention to detail in the way he applied a thin coat of oil, watching the grain come alive. It wasn't just fixing something, it was asterisk understanding it, coaxing out the hidden beauty. One evening, about the third week into this new routine, Sarah came out to the workshop, a mug of steaming coffee in her hand. The warm evening light was filtering through the small, grimy window, painting the motes of dust dancing in the air with streaks of gold. Dale was bent over a small writing desk, his brow furrowed in concentration, applying a careful, even layer of finish. He didn't even hear her approach. "Dale," she said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet whir of his orbital sander, which he immediately clicked off. He straightened up slowly, his back protesting slightly, but his eyes, when he turned to her, held a different light. Not the tired resignation she'd grown accustomed to, but a quiet fire. "Hey, hun," he said, wiping a hand on his jeans. "Coffee smells good." Sarah handed him the mug, her eyes, sharper than any young fella scanned his face, his hands. "You're out here late every night now," she observed, not with accusation, but with a gentle curiosity. "And you don't even look half dead anymore, like Kevin said." A faint smile played on her lips. "Your hands, they smell like wood, not oil." Dale took a long sip of coffee, savoring the warmth. He looked down at his palms, turning them over slowly. He hadn't really noticed the change in scent himself. "It's something else, Sarah," he began, his voice slow and deliberate as always, but carrying a new note she couldn't quite place. "This old desk, it was beat up, thrown out, but there's still good bones in it. Just needed someone to see past the grime, you know. Give it a second chance." He paused, looking around his dusty workshop, a space that was slowly, piece by piece, becoming his own creation. A quiet hope, stubborn and deep-seated, had finally broken through the surface. He met her gaze, his blue eyes holding a newfound steadiness. "Turns out you don't gotta be rich to build something that lasts. Just gotta find what makes your own hands feel useful and stick with it. Doesn't matter if nobody else gets it, long as asterisk you do. That's real success, I reckon." He took another sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through him, a feeling far deeper than the simple heat of the drink. Sarah had just stood there watching him, a slow smile spreading across her face, not a big, boisterous smile, but one that crinkled the corners of her eyes, full of understanding. "Well then," she'd said softly, picking up the empty coffee mug. "Don't let that old desk wait too long, Dale. It sounds like it's got a lot of life left to give." And he hadn't. Not a day went by after his shift at the plant that Dale didn't walk straight to that detached garage. The weight of the day's work still settled in his shoulders. Before that walk had been a chore, another step towards the weary slump into his armchair, the TV, a dull distraction from the hum of his own unanswered thoughts. Now, though, the air around the workshop door seemed to shimmer with a different kind of anticipation. The smell of sawdust and linseed oil began to replace the metallic tang of the factory, a scent far more appealing than any factory floor. He'd start slow, as was his way. The deep worry lines around his eyes were still there, etched by years of silent concern, but they seemed less about worry and more about focus when he was bent over a piece of wood. His thick, calloused palms, accustomed to the rough grip of machinery, now moved with surprising gentleness, sanding down a table leg, carefully stripping away layers of old varnish. The ingrained oil stains under his fingernails remained, a stubborn testament to his day job, but now flecks of fine wood dust mingled with them, telling a different story. One evening, Mark, his son, had stopped by. Mark, all ambition and new ideas, who'd always gently pushed his dad to do more or aim higher. He found Dale in the workshop, bathed in the warm, low light of a single bare bulb, hunched over what looked like a half-restored dresser. The room smelled of fresh-cut pine and something sweet like beeswax. "Hey, Dad," Mark had said, leaning against the doorframe, hands in his pockets. "What's all this, then? Gonna start a business?" Dale had paused, a piece of fine-grit sandpaper held between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't look up immediately, just ran his hand over the smooth, newly exposed grain of oak. "Nah, son, not a business." He finally looked at Mark, his tired blue eyes steady, almost sparkling in the dim light. "Just making something, giving an old thing a new lease. This was headed for the dump. Got a nice cherry top under all that grime, though." He'd slowly gestured with a rag still stained with stripper. "Been working on this for weeks, taking my time. Each joint, each dovetail, they tell a story. You just gotta listen." He paused, considering his words as he always did. "The factory, it's all about speed, efficiency, building things fast, moving 'em out. Here, it's the opposite. It's about slowing down, respecting the wood, respecting the work. Mark, usually quick with a reply, had just nodded, quiet for once. He watched his father, this heavily built man who'd always seemed so fixed in his routine, now moving with a grace he'd never seen, utterly absorbed. Weeks turned into months. Dale's workshop, once a quiet, dusty place for storing tools, became a haven, a place of constant, quiet creation. The older model Ford F-150, still reliable and dented, started carrying not just tools for work, but salvaged pieces of furniture picked up from curbsides or estate sales. The meticulous attention to detail he'd always applied to making sure a machine ran just right, he now poured into matching wood stains, fixing broken veneers and hand-rubbing finishes until the wood glowed. Sarah noticed the change most of all. He still drove to the factory every morning, still came home tired. But the deep-seated resignation that had once been a shadow in his eyes was gone. He still paid the bills, still lived paycheck to paycheck, but the constant worry seemed to have eased. He'd bring a newly restored end table into the living room, its wood grain gleaming under the soft lamp light, and a quiet pride would settle over him. He wouldn't boast, wouldn't even ask for compliments. He'd just look at it, then at Sarah, a small, satisfied nod his only acknowledgement. One crisp autumn evening, with the warm golden light of sunset filtering through the workshop window, highlighting the motes of dust dancing in the air, Dale finished a small writing desk he'd been agonizing over for months. He buffed the final coat of wax, the rich dark wood catching the light, reflecting the tools hanging neatly on the wall. He stood back, his strong grip unconsciously tightening on the rag, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He thought about the young, ambitious colleagues at the factory, chasing promotions, measuring their worth by the climb. He remembered his own quiet fear of being forgotten, of his life being just a blur of shifts and pay stubs. He ran a calloused hand over the smooth, cool surface of the desk. This wasn't about money. It was about the way his own hands felt useful, the way his mind was quieted by the careful work. It was about bringing something neglected back to life, giving it a purpose again. It was about knowing that long after he was gone, this solid piece of oak, patiently resurrected, might still sit in someone's home, a small, enduring testament. He walked out of the workshop, leaving the desk to cure, the scent of wood and polish clinging to his clothes. The air was cool, the stars just beginning to prick the darkening sky. He thought of his words to Sarah weeks ago, still true, perhaps even truer now. Turns out, you don't gotta be rich to build something that lasts. Just gotta find what makes your own hands feel useful and stick with it. Doesn't matter if nobody else gets it, long as ** you do. That's real success.